Hi everyone, it's time to review the next generation smartphone from Finnish company Yola, which is a Yola Phone 2. I know it's correct to call it Yola Community Phone 2 or Yola C2 since it's the second generation of the limited edition Yola C from 2016, but Yola Phone 2 just sounds cooler. In a nutshell, this smartphone is aimed at SelfieJOS enthusiasts as well as native app developers for the platform, and while SelfieJOS remains obscure for mass market or even in Linux community, it actually has hundreds of native apps and free app stores for them. The choice is pretty wide, as native apps range from a keyboard with voice recognition to an elaborate actions automation app similar to Apple Shortcuts app, for example. In my unboxing video, I already shared my first impressions of Yola C2. Sure, it's huge. In fact, this could be the biggest Linux smartphone ever made. But actually, the device is not as big as it may seem, especially compared to other modern smartphones. Plus, without the case it came with, it feels nice to hold, much like other big phones, until you put a case on them. The design may not be particularly eye-catching for some, there are no bright colors here, still it's very beautiful, looks much better in real life. Although I prefer colored back covers of Yola smartphones of the past, this shade opens up in a new way every time you look at it. The Privacy from Finland marking on camera block is also a nice touch. Build quality is top-notch, didn't expect that from a small Turkish manufacturer. Of course, own hardware is always hard. After the much talked about Yola tablet, the company hasn't released hardware since 2016, switching to Sony smartphones. So why Sony? Well, that's because Sony provides software binaries as part of its Open Devices program. They also provide Android open source project device configurations on GitHub, while also allowing to officially unlock devices bootloader for everyone. Nevertheless, Sony's smartphone sales continue to fall, and in 2024 the company essentially stopped selling smartphones in the largest market possible, the US. I think Yola can no longer depend on Sony, so Yola apparently has plans to optimize its system to mass market budget hardware. All in all, there's probably some calculation as to why the Turkish Reader S19 Max Pro S smartphone with Unisoc Tiger T606 processor, Melee graphics and a 6.52-inch IPS screen is taken as a base for Yola C2. On a positive side though, here we have 8GB of RAM and 128GB of internal storage, which is expandable with microSD. Also dual SIM plus microSD combo slot, audio jack and a proper 4000 mAh battery. The camera specs on paper are 64 megapixel for main camera, 16 megapixel ultra-wide, 8 megapixel secondary macro camera and 16 megapixel front camera. Although photo quality of course depends on software optimizations and it will be much improved with Camera 2 API integration. But wait, actually on any mobile Linux OS working state camera is achievement already. Speaking of price, Yola C2 was offered for €299, not terrible at all. As you can see, these are the specs of a regular budget smartphone, but when you compare it to the so-called Linux smartphones, the specs and price are not that bad. For comparison, here are the specs of the PinePhone Pro and Librem 5, which are two Linux smartphones that are available for sale as of today. That being said, Yola C2 is a real Linux phone, since you can easily access terminal, install Linux programs and dig into the file system with or without root privileges. Okay, why do I compare these two smartphones released 11 years apart? Primarily because there was a special Yola Love Day event for both. So in 2016 Yola introduced its first generation of Yola C, but it was technically not much different from the original Yola phone and was sold out very quickly. At the same time, Yola C2 was still available for ordering a couple months after the presentation, while additional batches also were announced in December. Important note, in December Yola finally published some instructions about C2 recovery mode and OS reinstall, which is essential in some cases. It's very important since Yola C2 is a special edition for developers and even users like me can break system to the point when reinstall is needed, let alone developers. Now, some of you might have seen the popular YouTube video about the original Yola phone, which is entirely focused on a problem of recovery mode. In that video, its author complains that he couldn't unlock someone else's password-locked Yola phone that he bought cheap on eBay. Well, apparently in 2013 the Yola team didn't consider password reset issue, but make no mistake, factory reset of Yola phone works correctly if it is your device. I personally have reset my Yola phone to factory settings multiple times. So the question is, does C2 have activation lock? Say, what will happen if a user forgets password and then refreshes the device? At this point we don't know. There was a couple of months delay before instructions for refleshing were posted, maybe due to the new Chinese SoC and also lack of resources, but it's still strange that instructions on how to refresh a device were not initially sought out and then quickly shared. It's a reference device aimed at developers after all, and that's a drawback. Why is it so important? Well, some users who ordered C2 had problems with smartphone activation process. The unfortunate error was that some devices were not sufficiently charged before being shipped. A manufacturing oversight coupled with software bugs set off an unfortunate chain of events causing device boot loops. And the problem is that users with defective smartphones had to send them back to Finland when they were manually refreshed by Yola, after which the smartphones were sent back to customers with initial setup already completed. All this resulted in additional costs, which surely didn't make Yola team happy. This is why easily user-accessible recovery mode is a must from day one, like on original Yola phone, given that Yola does not distribute OS images in a way it does for Sony smartphones. The bumpy launch was another Yola C2 problem. Luckily, initial setup of my Yola C2 went smooth. I'll put link to help article in the description. Another aspect of Yola C2 is that it lacks fingerprint scanner, which feels a bit dated. No tap to wake or lift to wake features are available, even though tap to wake was supported from day one on first Yola phone. Actually, there's an experimental software alternative built into the system. You can activate the sneak peek screen, also known as low power mode screen, which is hidden in system by default. The feature uses a proximity sensor. The easiest way to activate it is by taking smartphone out of your pocket. If you want, you can even enable a hidden option in settings. But why this option is hidden in the first place? Probably because in self-feature proximity sensor stops working occasionally. One more possible reason is that this feature drains some battery, so when idle, smartphone consumes 1% per hour, which for Yola C2 is almost twice as much as when sneak peek screen is off. How to enable this option you can read on Yola forum, I'll put link in the description. For someone it may be possible to live without fingerprint scanner if smartphone is unlocked all the time, as you can manually lock the phone only when needed. On self-OS you can quickly lock smartphone if double pressing lock button. However, it's much harder to live without tap to wake from original Yola phone. With no easy way for quick activation, I'm afraid the lock button will have excessive wear. Now, it goes without saying, with Yola C2 you get a very beta state software. People experience many small glitches here and there. For example, touch on password entry screen doesn't work from time to time after reboot. Sometimes built-in apps like settings or gallery just don't open until reboot. Also, some native apps may not work, for example, Pure Maps doesn't launch. There are also problems with microG signature spoofing activation. On my Yola C2 I needed to install an Android app support and configuring microG in a certain sequence. Unfortunately, even with microG properly configured, some programs still recognize that they are not installed from Google Play. However, this is just the reality nowadays. In my case, a government app is complaining about an incorrect installation, while local banks see no problem. There could always be some Android apps that refuses to work. Everyone's experience is different here. However, it seems to me that for most people, apart from banking apps, there are not many such apps so far, thankfully. So, Yola C2 is native hardware again, but what was before that? Looking back in history, after the original Yola phone launch in 2013, the company sold at least 50,000 smartphones, with orders came from 136 countries. The number of units sold may have been even higher, which we can consider a success for a small European startup. By the end of 2014, Yola had raised at least 42 million in investments, but then there was the famous Yola tablet campaign on Indiegogo, which ended in a complete fiasco due to circumstances that had little to do with Yola actually, like a Chinese factory refusing to ship tablets already manufactured and paid for, and so on. In early 2016, Yola received 20 million in another investment round. It was probably Russian money, which nevertheless allowed the company to stay afloat and not lay off all of its employees. Then came the transition to Sony hardware adaptation, with slow iterative progress along with new focus on serving authoritarian governments. Then I think the tipping point was separation of Android app support into a different software business related to automotive, which allowed Yola to attract new investments. Then Russian full-scale invasion in Ukraine started, Yola cut Russian ties after the business restructuring, and since 2024 they have been working on their own hardware, which includes AI computer as well as their new Yola-branded SelfishOS smartphone. Speaking of SelfishOS itself, version 5 seems to not bring many changes, while the company is thinking about what strategy to choose for SelfishOS further development. To summarize, what are the successes so far? While Yola has not been able to attract millions of users for their phones, still SelfishOS has a vibrant and large enough community which moves things forward. During this time, since 2013, here's what was discontinued: Microsoft Windows Phone, BlackBerry OS, WebOS by Palm, Ubuntu Mobile from Canonical at least, Tizen, which is ditched by Samsung almost completely, Firefox OS, and many other projects by hundreds of companies, big and small. So the fact that Yola SelfishOS is not shut down and continues to evolve is a success in itself. The big achievement of original Yola phone was its support of Android applications that was implemented right away, unlike in systems of slow and conservative BlackBerry and Microsoft. In 2014 already most Android programs could be made to work properly. Also, a very fun addition was Yola the other half accessories with NFC chips that included colorful phone covers and even a detachable keyboard. Unfortunately, with Yola C2 you can't remove the back cover at all, as manufacturer glues all internal components as much as possible in the worst traditions of modern smartphones. That was another advantage of Yola phone from 2014, I mean a user-replaceable battery, which is not there on Yola C2 or Sony smartphones. No easy battery replacement equals bad repairability, which is a big shortcoming for Yola C2. Wrapping up our comparison of two native SelfishOS devices, here's my short checklist of what has or hasn't changed over the past decade. First, working with Android application files. As you probably guessed, there are some nuances of selecting a photo or video from a file browser in an Android app. Since these are different locations in file system, you have to constantly move your media back and forth for any Android apps to see files. One solution would be to duplicate any media in the user's folders or implement some kind of links to user photos and videos specifically for Android apps. At the moment you should control all of this yourself, which is not very intuitive to say the least. Second, File Manager. It would be useful to have the built-in, but well-hidden, File Manager as a separate app on home screen. While File Browser from Yola Store is a great third-party alternative, still I believe a home screen shortcut to standard File Manager would be much more user-friendly. Third, blocking spam calls and SMS, either all unknown numbers or individual numbers. This was partially solved in SelfishOS 5. You can now block individual phone numbers, although you still can't block all unknown numbers, and still little can be done to tackle SMS spam, as the only solution is to mute all SMS notifications. Number 4 is outdated built-in browser with no ad blocking. In SelfishOS 5 the browser engine was updated to Mozilla USR 91, so the problem is partially solved for now. But it is obvious that updating the browser takes too much time and resources, making it the weakest point. In case of this browser update specifically, most of the work was done, as I understand, by a former Yola employee on a volunteer basis, which only emphasizes the complexity of such an update and what it actually means to development process. At the moment, most of the websites I tried are at least opening, which is not bad. However, for me the biggest problem is the lack of support for Firefox extensions such as Google Search Fixer and especially ad blockers. It's obvious that any ad blocker would improve browser performance substantially, plus Yola C2 is my only device I use right now that still lacks ad blocking capabilities. Number 5 is scrolling model and UI smoothness. Sorry to say that, but UI rendering on Yola phone is better than on Sony or Yola C2. This can be also said about Android apps. No progress here yet, unfortunately. So yes, several hotfixes have already been released for YOLO C2, probably many more to come. C2 optimizations might improve performance a bit, even though currently there are roughly 1000 units produced. For some reason, YOLO views this hardware as reference device. This could mean they are interested in optimizing OS for this hardware. What I think is Unisoc processors seems to be a risky bet, as MediaTek are far more common. Even Reader, the YOLO C2 phone maker, their smartphones mostly run MediaTek, so YOLO will probably need to support one more platform if they won't release YOLO C3 someday in future. Now let's talk about what's new in Sailfish OS 5, which is available as a free update for all officially supported devices on Sailfish OS 4, except YOLO Tablet and YOLO C1. The OS itself is now distributed on a subscription basis, costing €4.99 per month, which in theory should help YOLO get some resources specifically for Sailfish OS development. However, YOLO team will have to release updates more often if they want to rely on subscription model. Recently, I personally moved my app to subscription model as well, as I realized it's financially impossible to do any reasonable promotion and upgrade my app when it is a one-time payment. You can learn more about my app for Apple Watch in a separate video. The link to it is on screen. However, unlike mine, YOLO costs for Sailfish OS development will hardly ever be covered with a subscription that has, I don't know, several thousand users. So I see this subscription as a donation, only on a repetitive basis. For a limited time, YOLO also offers a perpetual license for some Sony smartphones. For YOLO C2 buyers, a 1-year subscription is already included, and YOLO also plans to propose a lifetime license. While all this is work in progress, we expect exact terms and pricing sometime in 2025. The Sailfish OS license can still be purchased from anywhere in the world with a VPN, which I encourage you to do to help with the development of alternative mobile OS. There's still a free trial version as well, which does not include Android app support and Microsoft Exchange accounts. So, what's new in Sailfish OS 5? At the time this video was made, on YOLO blog one couldn't find any news about companies restructuring, the new YOLO C2, Sailfish OS 4.6 or Sailfish OS 5 coming. From my point of view, this is a big omission, since not all potential Sailfish OS users visit YOLO forum, and many people may not even know how much changes YOLO had during the year. Anyway, let's take a look at what changed with new major version. First, initial tutorial is now easier to skip. Before you had to know that to skip it you should click on 4 corners in a circle from the top left, now it's just a button. Next, as I already said, default browser has been updated to Mozilla ESR 91, so more websites now work correctly. Sometimes though it still crashes. The browser is very slow on C2, performance is much worse than on Sony Xperia 10 revision 3. Basic support for Notch is added, as well as landscape orientation for all standard apps. With landscape orientation it's more of a reincarnation of YOLO tablet interface on the C2 large screen, while for Notch support some UI polishing still needed. With OS 5 we have automatic color coding, which is better than what's on iOS. We also now have phone numbers blocking, although there's no unknown colors blocking like on iOS. The weather app problem was solved by, well, scrapping the app entirely. Okay, I agree that it's better to allocate budget to something more worthwhile than weather service licensing. On Storman you can find MiCast, which is a popular weather app that also allows to add a widget to event view and lock screen. One more thing missing in Sailfish OS 5 is predictive text for keyboard. For now, it's unknown if this feature will be available in next OS versions, as the software component was licensed from a third party. YOLO seems to have lost their license after restructuring to YOLO Boys. Therefore, the predictive text input is not available for new Sailfish OS installations and for YOLO C2. But since I have Sony Xperia 10 revision 3 for some time, I had predictive text component already, so I extracted its files and then installed them on my C2. Now, let's quickly go through what didn't change in Sailfish OS 5. First, Bluetooth, as well as cellular connectivity, is not very stable in Android apps, at least on Sony smartphones. While on YOLO C2, mobile internet in Android apps doesn't work at all at the moment. It is promised to be fixed in next updates. Next, GPS still starts up slowly, both on various Sony and C2. Next, Android apps don't support fingerprint scanner, which may be hard to implement, but would be very useful for banking apps. Considering fingerprint sensor is not even in YOLO C2, ultimate reference device, apparently this is not a priority for now. In some good news, Sailfish OS still has fully functional mouse and keyboard support via USB and Bluetooth. Also, data transfer with Type-C flash drives and microSD cards still works great. Well, I think advantages and disadvantages of Yola C2 as a unique Linux phone for $299 are more or less clear. At your requests, and to be more complete, let's also compare Yola C2 to the Sony Xperia 10 Revision 3. First thing is comparing speed and smoothness. The poor performance of C2 is especially noticeable within first 2 minutes after device is turned on. This is caused by Android app support launching, and I hope this bug will be fixed soon. In general, performance is roughly comparable to Sony Xperia 10 Revision 2, although in many animations low FPS is clearly visible. Overall, performance leaves much to be desired, despite the more powerful processor than on Xperia 10 Revision 2, according to benchmarks at least, and also lower display resolution. If you compare to Xperia 10 Revision 3, there's no miracle so far, as system runs slower on weaker hardware, although I believe in the power of software optimization, which we saw with Yola phone up to Sailfish OS version 3. I think, when it started to slow down eventually. Next, poor performance of Android apps. Perhaps Android app support is still in the early stages of development for Yola C2, and performance will be improved over time. Obviously, weak hardware is also to blame. For example, watching videos in VLC is possible only in 720p, while on Sony it works normally in Full HD. The built-in player isn't much different. Speaking of RAM management, it is great on both devices. Next, the lack of LED indicator on C2 is a trend that I don't understand. LEDs are very convenient, especially when you can customize them for different types of notifications, contacts and so on, as it was on BlackBerry. For example, when I walk past an original Yola phone or Sony, I can immediately see if I've gotten a call or a message. I guess in theory it's possible to emulate LED notification on OLED screen, but surely not on Yola C2 with IPS, as such feature would be battery hungry. At the moment, GPS on the C2 is much slower than on Xperia 10 Revision 3. Again, hopefully this will be fixed in next updates. Also, on Yola C2 there's no NFS. Too bad, because NFS module would have been very interesting for developers. Another interesting question is whether camera is for notes only or more than that. Camera 2 API should be available in later versions of Sailfish OS 5, so right now things look bleak. Sailfish OS doesn't support low light mode, for example, and currently the image processing is pretty basic. Although with C2 there's one addition compared to Sony, as Yola C2 camera allows to take macro images. It works, that's it. Camera software is hard, so I'll leave it up to you to decide if it's critically bad or not. Next, on both smartphones, battery life with 2 SIM cards used is okay. Yola C2 drains roughly 0.6% in standby mode, with Android app support disabled, all apps closed and Wi-Fi and Bluetooth turned off. For comparison, Sony Xperia 10 Revision 3 drains around 1% in standby mode with similar settings. Overall, Yola C2's large battery should be enough for a full active day. At the same time, there's no easy battery replacements in both smartphones. With all the disadvantages I mentioned, Yola C2 has some clear wins. First, it has great design that can be compared to Sony's smartphones. It looks much more expensive than it actually is. Yola C2 feels great in hand, at least unless you put it in a case. Since screen size of C2 is big enough, it is good for reading and typing is also easier. And finally, from my experience, screen resolution is surprisingly not an issue overall. You really don't notice the low PPI unless you start watching videos in native resolution. Aside from that, Yola C2 screen resolution is no big deal. A general conclusion about Yola C2: could be much better, could be worse. For now, I rate it 3.5 out of 5 from a reference device point of view. The original promise was to experience Selfish OS as it meant to be, which in my view is theoretically possible to achieve, but only after numerous software improvements. Yola C2 poor performance, as well as lack of important features, hurts the device badly. Of course, no software improvements will change screen specs or the fact that there's no fingerprint scanner, but it's the Selfish OS optimization that can improve experience with a mediocre processor and camera hardware. Perhaps hardware improvements should be expected in a Yola C3, or maybe C2 will be tuned up by Yola in 2025. Time will tell. Thank you for watching this video, be sure to click like and subscribe button and let me know in the comments if you want more videos about Selfish OS.